Good morning. I have to apologize that I'm almost 10 minutes behind. This is due to some technical challenges on the back end here in the studio. As you notice, we're using a new platform now. And because I use that new platform, it requires more bandwidth. And one of the greatest challenges we face here in Zambia is bandwidth. So we tend to find that regardless of which network provider you use, on one particular day, that one will work, and then the other day, the other will work, and then you struggle with all this internet connectivity issues. But nonetheless, here we are, and we are ready to run. So we continue the series. As you know, it's Decoding the Days of Noah, Apostles of Deception Part 2. This is being transmitted on various platforms. It's live on Facebook as well as on YouTube. And one thing I know for certain is even if on the live we may not have many people come on yet, we know that there's many who watch this afterwards. And so if you're watching this afterwards, thank you for being part of this. Remember, you can ask your questions. I do come through and comments and answer many of those. And if we do get questions live on the call, then we can also be able to use that opportunity to make sure that we do share and I do respond as much as I can. So right now we're live and we continue with where we were. We were looking at the topic of decoding the days of Noah, and I am continuing on the Apostles of Deception. So remember, we looked at Alice Bailey as the first of the Apostles of Deception. And Alice Bailey herself is an individual that was very powerfully influenced by this very powerful individual called Madame Helen Blavatsky. And Helen Blavatsky worked very strategically and very hard with Alice Bailey to set up what she set up and to become a voice ushering in the golden age. In other words, the age to come, the golden age that they have all been pushing for, is what Alice Bailey spoke about. And in my last transmission, remember I told you or mentioned the 10-point plan that is gonna be effected by Alice Bailey and her disciples and all those that follow what she taught as part of their strategy for the coming age. So very, very serious stuff. Today we look at another man, a man called Friedrich Nietzsche. And interestingly, a lot of people don't know the story behind Nietzsche. In fact, one of the most amusing things is that so many people would quote Nietzsche because the zeitgeist quotes Nietzsche. Zeitgeist is just a big word for the culture. The culture quotes Nietzsche. And so Nietzsche is so fashionable. You find he's quoted in movies, he's quoted in books, and he's a massive influencer in a huge way. But a lot of people don't have a clue or an idea what Nietzsche stood for and what Nietzsche was about. So I'm gonna kind of give you a background. I'm not gonna go into a detailed history of Nietzsche, but for the purposes of just helping individuals to know who this man was, I will delve a little bit. I'll kind of help you get it. So Friedrich Nietzsche is the man credited with coining the phrase "God is dead." So if you ever heard that phrase, there's a whole franchise, Christian franchise movie series that was even coined out of it called "God is not dead." So God is dead, and then a little apostrophe, and up there it says "not dead." But the idea of God is dead was coined by this man Nietzsche. And if there's ever been an individual who personified and influenced the zeitgeist of modern society, it's this man, Nietzsche. Okay? Nietzsche is directly responsible for taking the atheist position brought about by individuals like Lyell and Darwin, who opposed creationism through their scientific papers and gave it a boost into anti-theism. So those of you not familiar, Lyell's the guy that came up with the whole issue of the geology, what we call the geology narration. I'm not going to go into detail again with that, but basically he put up all the papers around showing the age of the earth using geology strata. You know, if you go stand at the edge of a cliff or a canyon and look at that, you will see the different layers. And many times geological students teach that each of those layers represents different sedimentation periods throughout the ages. And so they use that to determine the age of the Earth. So according to these guys, the Earth is what, 3 billion years old, somewhere there? And so the argument is based on this science of which was brought about by a man called Lyell. And then Darwin, we all know, we learned Darwin in history. He's the man that came up with the theory of evolution. In fact, it wasn't really evolution. I think he was talking about the species and the whole aspect around the species and how they came about, and the fact that these were as a process of evolution. So Darwin threw out the God picture in that he well, it's never a problem, but he taught that this whole thing we see, this whole reality we see today, and humanity, animals, the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, were all evolved from a single organism, and he was able to do his postulations around how that came about. So very, very interesting views from that man. And then for Lyell, like I said, he's the one who did the whole thing on the stratification of geology. So these two became a big hit, a huge hit in the 19th century, because they came as radical thought around the concepts of mankind and science. And remember, we were at an era that time as people, it wasn't a disputed thing that creationism is the way. And so these guys came and challenged that convention, and they became the radical individuals that changed and impacted academia as we know it, especially science, and led to what we now see. So now, this, what's his name? Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche loathed all things Christian. He was influenced by that, and it led to his position where he became an anti-theist. So it's not just a case of being an atheist, but becoming an anti-theist. So what's the difference? An atheist doesn't believe in creation. End of story. He doesn't believe in the existence of a God somewhere. That's just out of the question. He is totally blank. There's no belief of any sort, especially in that regard. An anti-theist goes beyond just not believing in the existence of a God, but an anti-theist actually counters or fights against all things to do with God. So if there's any groups or individuals around somewhere who have this belief in God, then an anti-theist comes around and opposes that very powerfully. And so they are anti-God, in short. So with Nietzsche, Nietzsche wasn't just an atheist. He was an anti-theist. Why? He loathed all things Christian, as can be seen by some of his quotes, which I'm going to share. He was very strong about it. I can attest clearly that the venom being spat by many atheists on social media draws its inspiration from this man. Now, it's interesting, just for those who are not familiar with the history of Nietzsche. Nietzsche was born into a serious Christian family. In fact, his father was a minister of the gospel. Can you believe that? And so they were very Puritan, serious Christians, both the father and the mother. So he came from that background. But yet, as he grew older, as he became older, he opted to loathe and reject everything to do with his background. I have no idea why he chose to go that route, but historically, it's a fact that Nietzsche hated anything to do with the faith and with Christianity. And he came from that background. So it's very interesting. Another individual also who came from a very powerful Christian background is Aliester Crowley. And so both became apostles. I call them apostles of deception. And it's interesting to note that both came from homes of serious Christian ministers. And that should speak volumes about that particular situation. But nonetheless, I won't go much into that background, but just know that Nietzsche comes from a serious Christian background, but he goes on to reject and completely rebel against everything that he was raised on. So I want to now reproduce some words so that you can hear for yourself where the Antichrist poison that inspired Stalin, can you believe it? Stalin, Chairman Mao, King Jong-un, his father, grandfather, and even Hitler comes from. So Hitler was inspired powerfully by Nietzsche. Remember, Nietzsche was of German descent, so he came up with some very interesting views. So let's delve into those. When man becomes the ultimate God in his own eyes, there is no morality or ethics that count because he is the final authority. So let's look at some of the words Nietzsche stated. Nietzsche said, and I quote, "I regard Christianity as the most fatal and seductive lie that has ever yet existed. As the great unholy lie, I draw out the aftergrowth and sprouting of its ideal from beneath every form of disguise. I reject every compromised position with respect to it. I force a war against it." Those were the words of Nietzsche. I mean, this is deep. This is deep, and let me see if I can copy that, and we have it as a comment, because you got to understand the level of hatred that Nietzsche had for all things Christian. And like I say, we still cannot ignore the fact that he came from a Christian background and yet went on to hate it with all his heart. Now, this quote I've just read out to you is from a book he wrote called The Will to Power, a new translation by Walter Kaufman and H.J. Hollingdale of New York, Doubleday, 1967, on page 117. So that was Nietzsche's very powerful quote. And you see and hear his own words as he clearly states, with no mincing of words, his position when it comes to Christianity. So that I'm going to quote. So he's not just saying that I oppose it. I'm saying I'm fighting it. I'm putting up a war against this Christianity. So he truly loathed and hated it and has no kind words to say as far as the faith is concerned. So it's really, really interesting to hear what he had to say. Oh my God, did I? It looks like I have two quotes instead of one. All right, let's see if we can copy that there. So I'm going to show that on the screen. There it is. Okay, and he went on to say, we deny God, and in denying God, we deny responsibility. Only thus do we redeem the world. Powerful, eh? We deny God, and in denying God, we deny responsibility, and only thus do we redeem the world. So Nietzsche was big on the whole idea of denying God. And so this, as you can see, is anti-theist. It's not just a case of just saying, okay, you know what, God's not real, I don't care, I don't believe. But this is an active opposition. This, for lack of a better word, this is Antichrist. And this he wrote in Twilight of the Idols, which was published as a translation through Richard Polt, the Hackett Publishing Company, in 1997, page 37. So this is part of his own teachings, and he clearly says without denial, we deny God, and in denying God, we deny responsibility. Only thus do we redeem the world. So you see, this is not just the rantings of an atheist. This is an actual Antichrist, somebody who openly opposes the teaching of Christ, of God, in every way. Okay, and though he commended the person of Jesus Christ amazingly, he regarded the whole message of the gospel as false by stating, a God who died for our sins, redemption through faith, resurrection after death, all these are counterfeits of true Christianity, for which that disastrous, wrong-headed fellow, the Apostle Paul, must be held responsible. Again, in the book, The Will to Power. So according to Nietzsche, Paul and Pauline Christianity is the error here. Have you noticed that there's a number of movements and theological rantings, especially on spirituality, that really go anti-Christ but accept Jesus? It's so weird. I'm sure you've heard and come across that. If you haven't, well, I'm letting you know. A lot of people, you ask right now, what do you think of Jesus? They'll tell you, he was a great teacher, he was a great man, I was wonderful. The problem isn't Jesus. The problem is his followers who completely misaligned his message. Ironically, That's the position even of Islam. So if you study Islam and their position on who Jesus Christ was, according to the Muslims, Jesus Christ, whom they call Isa bin Maria, and they do the SWH, which basically means peace be upon him, was the last prophet to the Jews. This is the view of the Muslims. And he was such a pure, powerful man. He was born miraculously, never sinned. This is written in their Quran, so I'm not making this up. And so they regard him as the last great messenger to the Jews, who rejected him. And they, as far as they're concerned, did not die on the cross. He could not be caused to die on the cross. So what was at the cross was some apparition of some sort. It could not be the real prophet Jesus, according to them. That's impossible. And so therefore, the idea isn't really whether Jesus died on the cross. The idea is that he was translated, he was removed, and something else died there. And according to them, Jesus is coming back in the last days to fight and overcome Dajjal. But you see, the irony is that the position of the Muslims concerning Jesus is pretty much identical with Nietzsche here, because Nietzsche says that Jesus and the whole concept of Jesus was powerful. He commends that. But what he has issues with is the gospel as taught by Paul. So that's really interesting, because as far as we know, the gospel is complete, the New Testament is complete. The apostles were appointed by God himself through Christ and through the working and function of the Holy Spirit, and he was able to bring about the birth of the church. The church grew so powerfully that in spite of all the opposition that the church may have received, no one was able to completely overcome it. And that in itself is a very powerful testament to the truth of what the church represented and the power with which it operated. Don't forget that when the church began in the book of Acts, they were coming out of a very, very bad place. The religious authority had completely obliterated Jesus, the founder of the faith. And then on top of that, they had used their power as religious leaders to silence everyone. The apostles and everybody that believed were so frightened and so freaked out. But then when they were empowered by the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost, the same fearful lot came out with so much power and authority that everybody, including the leaders of the time, acknowledged that something strange had happened to the people. Acts chapter 4, I believe, when John and Peter are before the Sanhedrin. They are warned, they are flogged, they are told not to preach about Jesus, but they said would rather obey Jesus. And every one of those what are they called? Pharisees and Sadducees and the people that were in that council, Sanhedrin, realized that there's something unique about these men. They had been with Jesus. They recognize the DNA of Jesus in those individuals. So the whole idea that the New Testament is a con and what is the fabrication of, well, pretty much the Jews, because they were very opposed to the whole idea of the faith, of the Christian faith. Of course, that hundreds of years later led to terrible, terrible atrocities committed by Christians in the name of persecuting the Jews, chief of which, believe it or not, was people like Martin Luther, the reformer, who pretty much spent his life hating Jews. He wrote very, very, very anti-Semitic writings around that. A lot of people don't know that. We accredit him for such great work being part of the beginning of the Protestant movement, but history is very selective, and so history does not tell you that Martin Luther wrote a book which said some very strong words about the Jews. I've got it in my book. And not only did he say these strong words, it is the book that inspired Nazi Germany later. The Lutheran Church did later on come and make official apologies about their founder and the statements he made. But you see, all this really ties in with Nietzsche's position, like I'm saying. And it shows that even as we are here where we are right now, we realize that there's such a big deal when it comes to the Nietzschean thinking. So let's continue. So he what's the word? He really tells off and speaks negatively about hope. Now, continuing. The quotes that I've just shared with you are proof enough of the insidious nature of Nietzsche and his thinking, which has massive influence in society today. If you ever wonder where the poison you're witnessing is, coming from? This is the man. There's another component to Nietzsche that a lot of people don't like to hear. Nietzsche was actually responsible for writing a book where he teaches about the overman. The overman is a German term for the overman. He believed with all his heart that man was still evolving, and because man was still evolving, man was going to reach his ultimate level. And for that to happen, he had to get rid of his less desirous sides. So the concept and idea was how man needs to let go of his base side and move on to his evolved side, which includes let going of all weak aspects of humanity. I mean, it's not a secret. Nietzsche clearly stated that weak human beings with, people that are diseased, people that are lame, people that have defects on the body are all part of the humans that should be discarded. So in his Overman treatise, he was very clearly stating that people of weaker, lesser, inferior quality should pretty much be gotten rid of because they are messing up with the gene pool. They should not even be allowed to propagate. I'm not exaggerating. Nietzsche wrote that. It was that writing by Nietzsche that inspired Hitler. When you read the book Mein Kampf, that's My Struggle, by Hitler, Hitler was inspired by Nietzsche's treatise on the Overman, or the Overman. So as far as Hitler's concept of the Aryan race and the superior race and his experiments during Nazi Germany, the getting rid of Jews, all these things were all part of the Overman philosophy created by this guy called Nietzsche. Now, it doesn't even end there. Nietzsche lost it because Nietzsche projected a book. He wrote a book called the Zarathustra. Like he claimed that he was a recipient of a transcendent being in himself, and this being would write through him. So he did write some serious stuff. I just didn't share it, but he wrote some seriously negative stuff around man and who he's supposed to be. And in his writings, the Zarathustra writings, which is Zoroaster really, in the Zarathustra writings, that's where he goes to town in belittling people he called of inferior stock. So the idea of, what's it called? There's a term for it. It's just gone. But I think it's eugenics. Yeah, eugenics. The idea of breeding out the bad. So you get rid of all these bad people. You prevent them from being able to procreate. And then you focus on procreation for the stock and the people you want. I mean, in fact, basically scientific racism and white supremacy really took us a whole new stretch thanks to people like this man. Because white supremacy basically stated that white people are the most superior. And if you go and start to study the different white people, you find that in those circles, the lower end of the white people are like the gypsies, and of course the Jews. They were considered to be vermin. I mean, what's his name? What was his name? The name is gone, but the gentleman that, sorry, it's not the gentleman, the man that came up with all the propaganda in Nazi Germany, the name is just gone. It's not Mengele, it's Joseph. The name is just gone. It slipped my mind. I'm so sorry about that. This gentleman, when he was writing his material, he literally got all his material off what he saw and learned from the Overman philosophy propagated by Nietzsche. And so he began to do campaign materials that showed Jews as rats. He did a lot of material. It was really negative, and he pushed it out there into the public. And it's Hitler who's on quote. Trust Maxwell EX to say that Hitler was a great man. No, he wasn't a great man at all. He was an absolutely evil man as far as I'm concerned. So it's so interesting that when you read up on these individuals, you realize that they were inspired by this man, Nietzsche. And so going back to Nietzsche, he got this material, put it together, and shared it, and he had the Zoroaster writings. Those writings were so powerful because he really went to town speaking about the superiority of races. And the two races that he thought were most superior were, of course, the two ran with this, like very powerfully, were the Germans. We know about that because we saw what Hitler did. And then the other group are the British. We know that when Cecil Rhodes came to Africa, he is on record writing and saying that the greatest of humanity are the British, and the British deserve to be highlighted and placed as the chief stock amongst humanity. And even in the British, it also varies. As far as they're concerned, the English were the most superior. Okay, so the English are the most superior, then the Scottish follow, and then the least are the Irish, and well, the Welsh and the Irish, if you follow that. That's why a lot of Irish had to migrate out of England, because they were treated badly by the English, so to speak. I mean, this is not something I'm making up. That's historically true. So the English considered themselves superior, and of course, because of their Aryan connection to the Germans also considered themselves superior. So the Germans and the English considered themselves the topmost human stock, and white supremacy was ultimately pushed by that ideology. And that ideology is the work of Nietzsche. Zoroaster's writings, and by the way, Zoroaster was a projection. He was being projected. Nietzsche was channeling. You know, this is the concept that you hear people like Alice Bailey and Blavatsky talk about, even Leadbeater, who is one of the Leadbeater, I think, who is one of the proteges of Blavatsky from the Theosophical movement, all admit to being channels. They channel these beings who then inspired them. Aliester Crowley does the same as well. They channel these beings. As far as I'm concerned, that's proof of the demonic. And did you know that Nietzsche finally ran mad? Nietzsche just lost his mind and went stark raving mad. But that's interesting, because by the time he was running stark raving mad, he had already produced all these writings, of which Zoroaster is one of them, the Will to Power, and all these things, the Overman. And these works were what were picked up by all the key psychologists of the time, Carl Jung, and all these famous influential individuals that then led to shaping humanity. So I call Nietzsche an apostle of deception, because he pushed the agenda very powerfully. He taught very powerfully this truth about the superiority of man. So essentially, when all is said and done, Nietzsche, just like Bailey, just like Blavatsky, just like Crowley, just like Hitler and Stalin and Mao and Kim Jong-il and all these, leaders that, popped up in the 20th century, were essentially influenced by that thinking. And the core of it is apotheosis. So apotheosis is the concept that man is God. So it's the God-man. Humanism is really rooted in that concept as well. So you see that humanism was born, and the idea behind humanism is man is the center of all endeavor. And so there is no divine concept in humanism. Humanism is about humanity. And at its core, at its heart, is the teachings and the concept of apotheosis. And so apotheosis very powerfully opposes the concept of theology, or the concept of a theocracy, or a concept that God, a creator, exists, and this creator has his will. Man is like, forget about the will of God. Our will is supreme. And so in my next transmission, I'm going to go deep into talking about Aliester Crowley, because Aliester Crowley is the next guy in the list, the third gentleman who, in my opinion, was also a very, very powerful influencer. In fact, a lot of Hollywood and the entertainment industry today is influenced by Aliester Crowley. It's amazing in terms of how Aliester Crowley has not had a movie made about him. And I think the reason they haven't made a movie about him is because the guy did horrendously detestable stuff. And really, we'll see what they do, because The truth is that many of the singers, rockers, and individuals really hold Aliester Crowley in high regard, in spite of the fact that he was an absolutely deplorable human being. And I'm going to get into details about that in my next transmission next week. So on that account, I want to thank you all for being part of the call. I didn't see any major comments or questions coming through, so I'm going to allow, we'll chat more in the chat after the transmission. Remember, you can share this link to others to watch. And like I say, my next transmission, which is the third part of the Apostles of Deception, is Aliester Crowley, self-proclaimed beast and founder of Thelema. That's very interesting. You'll be surprised who are members of Thelema. Maxwell X turns around and says Hitler was a great man, but not a good man. Haha, very interesting. Well, he was a great man in that, yes, he influenced the world and changed the world as we know it. But being a good man, nah, he personified evil in the true sense of the word. And in many ways, the difference between Hitler and Stalin, I think, is the fact that Hitler did it to the whole world. And then he deliberately fought the Jews in a very direct way, like never seen in the history of the world, except in the ancient world. And in many ways, I think Stalin didn't do that, so he got away with it. But the truth of the matter is that Stalin killed far more people than Hitler did. And that's the proof that atheism and anti-theism is really bad. Between Stalin and Mao, those two together killed in excess of 120 million people, direct and indirect, caused the deaths of over 120 million human beings in their nations. Stalin was so feared that when he died for 12 hours, or was it 8 hours, nobody could even approach his body to confirm he's dead. And it took a cleaner who came in to do the usual cleaning. We said, this man's been dead for a long time. And that's how much they feared this guy. That's how scary Stalin was. Okay, so Stalin has a very interesting backstory, but I believe all these guys were massively influenced by Nietzsche, massively influenced by the thinking of the time, where apotheosis became the center. So on that note, I want to thank you all for being part of this transmission. Join me next week, Friday, when we look at the last of the Apostles of Deception, Aliester Crowley. Have a great day, and well, God richly bless you. I will continue to comment in the comment boxes. We'll be able to interact over there. All right, I'm trying to end my transmission, but you know, it's one of those situations where it's not popping up to end the transmission. So either way, thank you for being part of this call and being here.